I'm just going to give a quick bio of Katherine, and then she is going to give you this incredible historical presentation. And of course, she has very deep-rooted roots here in Santa Fe, and of this hotel, which I'll let her tell you. Katherine Promonis has a BA in History and Anthropology from the University of Rhode Island. She worked 20 years in administration at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology at UNM, where she managed the day-to-day operations of the museum and occasionally curated exhibits. She also served as the president of the New Mexico Museum Association, which we're hosting in November. They'll be here at IAIA, and we're the host hotel for that, just a side note. As a native of Santa Fe, Katherine has a lifelong interest in the history of the city different. The title of her talk today is Making Sense of Santa Fe, a Chronological History. So, Katherine, welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Ed, for asking me to come here and give a talk today. Before I begin my talk on making sense of Santa Fe, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself and why I decided to research this topic. I was born and raised in Santa Fe. My parents both came from Greece to the United States, my father in 1910 and my mother in 1929. In 1930, they settled in Santa Fe, and my father opened a restaurant on the south side of the plaza. They called it the Mayflower Cafe. As a child, my playground was the plaza, and I would often visit the New Mexico Museum of History in the Palace of the Governors. I remember looking at their dioramas of prehistoric Indian pueblos and a mummified Indian child who had been buried in a turkey feather blanket holding 2 ears of corn. Needless to say, this piqued my interest in archaeology. I also participated in the yearly celebration of the fiesta. That's me. This photo was taken during World War II. If you look closely, you can see 2 soldiers in the background. Also, look closely at the 2 women sitting on a low wall. This wall surrounded the plaza. The plaza at that time was more than 18 inches lower than it is today. I remember you had to step down into the plaza. I also have fond memories of La Fonda. My most memorable one was my wedding in the Santa Fe room in 1958. Followed by dinner and dancing in this room. And Jimmy Palou had his orchestra on whatever, up here. Okay, I have lived on both coasts, California and Washington, D.C., and after 20 years returned to my home. On my return, I worked at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. And when I retired, I began my own research projects. I received a fellowship from the New Mexico State Historian's Office to research and write a book on the history of the Greeks of Albuquerque, which was published in 2012. More recently, I was asked by the Albuquerque Museum to curate an exhibit on a topic that both socially and economically impacted Albuquerque. Because tuberculosis and the railroad were the 2 leading forces impacting Albuquerque in the late 19th and early 20th century, I chose the tuberculosis industry, as there were 17 TB sanatoriums in Albuquerque alone and 54 in New Mexico. It was an industry. The exhibit opens in April of 2017. Now, let's get back to why I started researching my talk, Making Sense of Santa Fe. Here is a photo of the south side of the plaza. The building you see was the site of La Castrense, the Spanish military chapel built in 1760. It had a beautiful altar screen, or reredos, carved by artisans who were brought from Mexico by the governor. The white stone for the reredos was quarried from the Jacona region of northern New Mexico near Milwaukee. This military chapel closed in 1835, and the reredos was moved down the street to the cathedral. In 1940, the reredos was moved again, this time to the newly built Cristo Rey Church on Upper Canyon Road. If you haven't seen it, please do. I highly recommend it, especially since now you know its history. The Galleria now sits on the site where La Castrense was once located. There is a plaque on the outside wall of this building commemorating it. However, starting in 1930, This was the site of my father's cafe, the Mayflower Cafe, which closed in 1955. I have a deep affection for Santa Fe and its fascinating history. I have seen many changes to the downtown area, which led me to want to know more about what was once here during other times. My talk is about these changes. 19th century Santa Fe was an architectural wonderland of steeples, gables, pitched roofs, and even Greco-Roman columns. These architectural features and styles that now seem so oddly out of place were intended to convey the impression that Santa Fe was anywhere USA. The purpose of this generic architecture was to accelerate New Mexico's transition into statehood. General Sherman visited Santa Fe on a trip with President Rutherford B. Hayes. The general had urged Santa Feans to give up their burros and their goats, and he stated that he hoped within 10 years he wouldn't see another adobe house in the territory. General Sherman said, "Yankees don't like flat roofs, nor roofs made of dirt." What the general didn't understand was that Santa Fe was and always will be the city different. I end this introduction with a joke you may have already heard. How many Santa Feans does it take to screw a light bulb?
The whole population.
5. 1 to climb the ladder and screw it in, and the 4 to stand around saying, "We liked it better the other way it was." Santa Fe's history is so rich that, of course, I will not be able to cover it fully. So I have selected aspects of it that I have found interesting and important. I will begin by presenting the history of Santa Fe through the lens of the Law of the Indies. The Law of the Indies was a law on town planning issued by King Philip II of Spain in 1573. This law was to accompany all expeditions to the New World. It dictated that the location, layout, form, and settlement patterns were to be as follows. The plaza, also known as Plaza de Armas, was to be 1 1/2 times long as wide in order to accommodate fiestas and military drills of men mounted on horses. The cathedral was to be sited on elevated ground. Government buildings, or Las Casas Reales, which included the governor's housing and the presidio, or military fort, was to be sited along the north side of the plaza. Sidewalks were to be sheltered by portals. The area must be fertile and have abundant water. Here we are looking at the earliest map of Santa Fe, drawn by Jose de Urrutia in 1766. I am using it to acquaint you with these geographic features. The first law of the Indies dealt with the Plaza de Armas. The plaza was designed for military and religious functions and is to be constructed at least half again as long as its width, as this form is best for celebration with horses. 2 archaeologists, Bruce Ellis and Cordelia Snow, speculated that the plaza originally extended as far east as St. Francis Cathedral and was 4 times its present size and extended south down to Water Street. In 1990, archaeologists excavated the plaza to see what it had been back in 1610. These archaeologists were awarded the Cow Chip Award because they discovered this excavation that it had been a plaza. The second law of the Indies dealt with the church. La Parroquia, or parish church, was built east of the plaza. The church's plan and location is unknown, but it is believed to have stood immediately behind the present cathedral, facing west as the cathedral does today. It contained the statue of La Conquistadora, or Lady of Conquest. More on this statue later. Another church, San Miguel Mission, was built in 1626 and was used as a parish church to serve the religious needs of the Indian laborers brought from Mexico. It was located in the Barrio de Analco, which means the other side of the river, which is south of the Santa Fe River. It is now considered Santa Fe's oldest neighborhood. This was the first section of Santa Fe to be sacked and razed during the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. The third law of the Indies dealt with las casas reales, or royal house. It included the palace of the governor, where the governor's apartments, private apartments, official reception room, and the office and servants' quarters were located. It also included the presidio, where the troops were garrisoned and where the stables and arsenal were. The casas reales also contained a vegetable garden of 10 acres and 2 torreones, or defense towers, one used as a prison and storage for gunpowder, and the other as a chapel. It is not known what it really looked like because the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 resulted in the destruction of virtually every locally generated scrap of paper documenting everyday life in New Mexico. Any physical description of the plaza between 1610 and 1680 has been pieced together from only fragmentary evidence based on correspondence sent to Mexico and Spain, post-Reconquest recollections, and scant archaeological evidence. The fourth law of the Indies dealt with portals. I will talk about them later. The fifth law of the Indies dealt with the selection of the site for a villa. This was to be based, among other things, on the abundance of drinking and irrigation water. The Santa Fe River flows freely down the Sangre de Cristo Mountains through the Santa Fe Canyon. In past years, this river overflowed its banks and created floodplains, believe it or not. According to David H. Snow, colonists and Pueblo Indian conscripts dug 2 acequia madres, otherwise known as mother irrigation ditches, in order to water fields on either side of the river. There may have been as many as 38 branches from these 2 acequias. Note the annotations, acequia para regadío, which means irrigation ditch. Lacking references to Santa Fe's acequias prior to 1680, we can only guess at their locations and courses. However, it can be argued that the North Ditch supplied the plaza and its administrative and military compound, the parroquia or parish church, and the settlers' fields and gardens adjacent to the plaza. Here is a map showing the contemporary acequia madre. Have any of you know where the acequia madre, have you seen it at all? No? Okay. Ciénaga is Spanish for marsh. There were ciénagas found in several areas of the villa. The water table was known to be high in Santa Fe. Today, there is a street 3 blocks east of the plaza off Palace Avenue that is called Ciénaga Street. This marsh may have been the source of the acequia, which led into the Casas Reales. It may also have been the acequia that was cut off by the Indians during the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, leaving the colonists and their cattle without water, forcing them to flee. And it may have also been the water source that de Vargas cut off in 1693, allowing him to take back the palace from the Indians. Note the slope aspect of the landscape. The Ciénaga, or Arias Pond, was located higher than the surrounding area, so it may have drained into Bishop Lamy. I'm sorry, I grew up in Santa Fe. We always called it Lamy. I know it's supposed to be Lamy. Is that it? Lamy? Okay. Okay, let's see. Garden behind the parroquia. We will discuss that later. Here is a photo of Santa Fe in 1866, showing corn growing in the Ciénaga. In this photo, you can see 4 pieces of the law of the Indies: the plaza, the palace, the church or parroquia, and the water. Now the stage is set. Let us look at the drama that unfolded on it. We will see that this law continued to play a central role in the history and evolution of Santa Fe. It almost writes the history itself. As you recall, in 1573, King Philip II of Spain issued the Law of the Indies, or the rules on town planning in the New World. Don Juan de Oñate was subject to these laws when he came to New Mexico in 1598. Don Pedro de Peralta was also subject to these laws when he replaced Oñate and moved the capital to Santa Fe in 1610. La Villa Real de Santa Fe de San Francis de Assisi, or the Royal City of the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi, is the oldest existing capital city in the United States. The Pueblo Revolt took place in 1680. 21 clergymen were killed, as were 380 settlers living in ranches in the surrounding area. The Spaniards, under the leadership of their governor, Don Antonio Oderman, were able to escape to the mission of Guadalupe de Paso, 300 miles south, taking with them a 26-inch tall willow wood statue of Mary. The Casas Reales was then torn down by the Indians, and they used the adobes to build their own fortified pueblo. This pueblo may have been 2 to 3 stories high with 2 plazas and no openings on the ground floor. In 1693, the reconquest of Santa Fe was led by General Don Diego de Vargas and entailed fierce fighting. He had also led one of the previous year, which had been bloodless. They brought with them the 26-inch tall willow wood statue of Mary and renamed her La Conquistadora, the Conqueress. His successor, Don Pedro Rodriguez de Cubero, demolished the Indian pueblo and in 1697 replaced it with 6 high buildings and 6 low ones, which were used as royal houses. In 2000, archaeologists excavated behind the palace and uncovered a large pit containing artifacts and cobbles, burned adobes, and other historic debris. They speculated that these materials may have been the remains of the above-mentioned houses built in 1697 by Don Pedro Rodriguez de Cubero. In 1713 to 1717, a new parish church, La Parroquia, was erected. It stood forward more than the previous church, thus foreshortening the plaza on its east side. On the northeast side of the church, a special chapel was built to honor La Conquistadora. This adobe chapel is still located there, as is the statue. In 1760, when Bishop Tamarón of Durango visited Santa Fe, he noted that there was no formal presidio building. In that year, the military chapel was built. As I mentioned in my introduction, it was called La Castrense, Nuestra Señora de la Luz, or Most Holy Mother of Light. This photo was taken in 1866, and I provided here to give you an idea of the location of the chapel. It was located on the south side of the plaza, where the Galleria now stands. The chapel had a beautiful altar screen, or reredos, carved by artisans who were brought from Mexico by the governor. The white stone was quarried from the Jacona region near Pewaukee of northern New Mexico. I will show you a photo of the reredos later in this presentation when we cover the place of its new home. The earliest map of Santa Fe was drawn in 1766, Second Lieutenant Jose Ruruda. It does not show the buildings that Don Pedro Rodriguez de Cubero built in 1697. It also fails to show the presidio. Here is an annotated version of Urrutia's map. Note the acequia para regadío, or irrigation ditch. This is probably the bed of the current acequia madre. This bird's eye view of Santa Fe was painted by Wilson Hurley based on the 1767 map of Jose de Urrutia. As you may recall, back in May 1760, when Bishop Tamarón of Durango visited Santa Fe, he noted that there were no formal presidio buildings. 16 years later, in 1776, Fra Dominguez described the mournful appearance of the villa. He also noticed that the fields, gardens, and orchards were irrigated with water from acequias from the Santa Fe River or from cienagas or marshes east of the plaza. By 1780, officers of the Santa Fe Company were concerned about the inadequacy of the government buildings, or casas reales, which you now know includes the governor's housing and the presidio. These officers pledged 2,175 pesos from their retirement fund for its construction. However, there were many years of delays due to the Viceroy's late approval and a shortage of funds. In 1788, 8 years later, the lumber project for the presidio had been cut and stacked. The straw had been collected for the fabrication of the adobes. At last, approval came from the Viceroy, and the Governor de la Concha called upon all unemployed settlers between the ages of 14 and 50 to present themselves as wage laborers. Construction started in 1789. By 1791, construction again was delayed due to several months of heavy rain, which ruined some 80,000 adobe bricks. Nevertheless, construction was completed that year. In 1982, archaeologists excavating behind the palace found a thick layer of sand. They believed it was related to the massive summer storm in 1791 that destroyed the 80,000 adobe bricks. They also speculated that the finds from this excavation are related to the construction of the new Spanish presidio completed in 1791. Juan de Pagazartundua, there's four, Pagazartundura. Okay, a military engineer in Chihuahua City drew up a plan of this second presidio from specifications provided by people familiar with the construction of this 1791 presidio. The single entrance to the entire complex is on the south side facing the plaza. I quote from an article in El Palacio magazine, 1982. The plan of the 1791 presidio shows an irrigation ditch, conductas de agua, L, in the PowerPoint. Could this be the Casas Reales Acequia of 1680 running through the middle of the compound? Laundries, lambraderos, H, are situated on this ditch. This ditch is now Marcy Street. An adobe wall surrounds the presidio. Surrounding the interior compound are little over 100 quarters for troops, K, with their respective corrals. The sergeant's quarters, J, are in the northwest, northeast, and southwest corners. A garden, E, is north of the governor's residence. The palace, D, a guard room, B, and a jail, C, are attached to the west side of the residence. Note, these last two rooms are later removed from the palace to make room for Lincoln Avenue. This presidio extended nearly a quarter of a mile north of the plaza to where the present federal building is now located. Here are the present-day streets. From the Santa Fe Historical Neighborhood Study of 1988, I draw this information. During the Spanish colonial era, an acequia or irrigation ditch ran northwest from Santa Fe River and curved around into the military compound behind the palace. This was probably the acequia that was cut off by the Indians and subsequently cut off by de Vargas at the time of the Reconquest. The Santuario de Guadalupe was built in 1795 to serve the people in the outlying areas. It was located beside the El Camino Real. El Camino Real was later known as the Chihuahua Trail, the principal trade route from Veracruz to Mexico City to Chihuahua to Santa Fe. It later became known as Agua Fria Street. By 1798, the parroquia, built in 1717, was in ruinous condition. A well-to-do citizen of Santa Fe had the church completely renovated. On the right side of the photo is the present-day site of La Fonda. Also around 1798, Doña Maria Gertrudis Barcelo was born in Mexico. She was otherwise known as La Doña Tulis, a most engaging character of the western frontier. Her Monte Casino was located where the Santa Fe County Courthouse was or is. Is it still there? The county courthouse. Is it still there? Do you know where it is? It's behind the Lenzig Theater. Because they said they were going to tear it down, or they were moving the county courthouse. Did they move it? Not yet. Okay. It is located on Grant Avenue behind the Lenzig Theater. In 1806, Rosario Chapel was built northwest of town to commemorate the site where General de Vargas and his troops and colonists encamped during the Reconquest of Santa Fe in 1693. Freezing wind and snow took a ghastly toll. In 1821, with the signing of Treaty of Cordova, Mexico secured its independence from Spain, and New Mexico becomes a Mexican territory. Prior to 1821, the Spanish government excluded foreign traders into New Mexico. After 1821, the Mexican government allowed foreign traders into New Mexico. These new foreign traders opened the Santa Fe Trail and linked Nuevo Mexico with the United States. William Becknell in 1822 came from Missouri along the Santa Fe Trail and opened the link between traders from the east with merchants in Santa Fe and eventually Chihuahua City. The most serious problem in New Mexico during the Mexican period was a lack of adequate finances from the Mexican government to maintain the bare essentials of the government. La Castrense, the military chapel, was closed by 1835 because the Mexican government withdrew its support for churches and clergy, and also the chapel's structure had deteriorated through neglect. The reason the Mexican government withdrew support was they suspected the clergy, many who came from Spain, would continue to be loyal to the Spanish crown. In 1844, Josiah Gregg wrote the first book to focus on the Santa Fe trade. It is entitled Commerce of the Prairies. He had tuberculosis and found that the weather in New Mexico made him feel better. He encouraged others to come for their health. United States Attorney W.W. Davis wrote, "When New Mexico becomes a state, the faithful burro should be engraved on the coat of arms as an emblem of its cardinal virtues." Charles F. Loomis echoed those sentiments, calling burros the cornerstone of New Mexico. The burro, and I say it as we did in Santa Fe, the burro, originally came with the Spaniards via ancient Africa as probably the first domesticated beast of burden. Burro brigades were a common sight in 19th century Santa Fe, staggering beneath loads of firewood, produce, whiskey kegs, and the powerful Taos lightning and every conceivable thing. My mother and dad came to Santa Fe in 1930, and my mother remembers seeing those burros. So that's how long ago and recent they've been here. Viva for Burro Alley and the burros that slept and ate there. In 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. In 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, New Mexico was annexed to the United States and became an American territory. Brigadier General Stephen Watts Kearny, commander of the Army of the West, marched his troops into Santa Fe, raised the U.S. flag over the palace of the governor, and proclaimed himself military governor. An earthenworks defensible star fort was built on the hill northeast of downtown Santa Fe. It was never garrisoned. This is what some people presume to be Fort Marcy. Maps prepared by U.S. Army First Lieutenant Gilmer in 1846 show the existing Mexican presidio. He noted the public grounds, which were the 55-year-old remains of the 1791 Spanish presidio. During this early territorial period, the Army utilized the presidio, which was later to be called a post, stabilizing the old military barracks and developing more barracks, corrals, and related structures for garrisoning U.S. troops. By 1850, a more traditional post was built and named Fort Marcy after Secretary of War William L. Marcy. It was in operation for more than 48 years. We don't have a map of the 1850 map, so we will continue to use the 1846 Gilmer map. The post was encircled by a protective wall with towers. It eventually had a chapel, jail, supply rooms, wagon yards, stables, kitchen, a forge tannery, and servant quarters. Not only are the governor's residence and the entrance similarly placed on the two maps, Juan's and Gilmer's, but the irrigation ditch, which is now Marcy Street, still runs through the middle of the compound in 1850 as it had in 1791. Now, both ends of the Santa Fe Trail were in the hands of the U.S. The trail was no longer the international road that it had been since 1821. Its politics and economy began to move in directions familiar to Americans. One of the most visible signs of change was the era of foreign-born merchants, or settlers. These men dominated the commerce of Santa Fe. They were Sigmund Seligman and his brother Bernard and the 6 Spiegelberg brothers. Another merchant was Abraham Stab. He built the lovely mansion on Palace Avenue, which is now the hotel known as La Posada. His wife's ghost supposedly haunts one of the rooms. In 1851, one of the most influential figures in the history of Santa Fe arrived, Bishop Jean-Baptiste Lamy, later to become Archbishop. I quote directly from El Palacio magazine, Winter 2012. He was not merely concerned with the spiritual conversion and welfare of the people he was sent to serve, but their economic and nutritional welfare as well. He introduced fruit and nut trees to each village which had a church. He began acquiring foreign varieties of grafted fruit trees through contact with Durango, Mexico, New Orleans, St. Louis, Los Angeles, and some even directly from France. His lodge in Tesuque became a major experimental orchard for horticultural evaluation and propagation. On the grounds south of St. Francis Cathedral, in the heart of Santa Fe, Lamy planted over an acre of fruit trees and berry vines. It is now a parking lot. From the Santa Fe Historical Neighborhood Study of 1988, I draw this information. During the Spanish colonial era, the area northeast of the plaza was a marsh, known as La Ciénaga, which was fed by several springs and used also for growing hay. It is said that Lamy once pointed out the source of water, which arose from the Ciénaga, now Ciénaga Street, coursed through the church's land to the patio inside of the Palace of the Governor. At this time, La Castrense, the defunct military chapel south of the plaza, was used by the U.S. forces as an ammunition storeroom and then as a district court. By 1859, the stone reredos was removed and replaced in the sanctuary of La Parroquia. In 1940, this reredos was moved into the newly built Cristo Rey Church, the largest modern adobe structure designed by John Gaw-Meem. It took 180,000 adobes to build, with most of the work done by the people of that area. Around 1860, the Carl Brewery, you heard it, brewery, located far to the east of Palace Avenue, began using the water of the Santa Fe River to manufacture all types of beer, including lagers and ale. When the brewery experienced financial troubles, it was sold to the Fisher family. They added an ice-making machine from which they made up to 3 tons of ice at a time from the Santa Fe River and stored it in a cave in the hillside behind the brewery. Adolph Bandelier and friends were frequent patrons to the Terrace Bar. Entries into Bandelier's journal provide insight into the socializing at the brewery, from frequent visits to the celebration of holidays, such as New Year's and birthdays. One such entry read, "Spent this afternoon to the brewery with Charles Loomis. The next day, unwell, as might be expected." The earliest tombstone or headstone found at the Santa Fe Fairview Cemetery, which opened in 1884, has a date of 1862. When the Masonic Temple was built, this headstone was removed from the Masonic Oddfellows Cemetery, just northeast of the downtown area to Santa Fe to Fairview Cemetery. In 1862, the federal forces occupied Santa Fe briefly and flew their flag over the plaza before they were defeated at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, 20 miles northeast of Santa Fe. Okay, starting in 1863, William Manderfield arrived and became publisher of the Santa Fe New Mexican. Other Easterners and European merchants also arrived. They were Dendals, who had a dry goods store, Pflugers, who had a shoe store, Connie's, as we know, had a grocery store, Spitz had a jewelry store. Do any of you know Spitz? Do you know who Spitz was? Nobody. Nobody. I can't believe it. You know who Spitz?
Well, they had the jewelry store on the south side of the plaza. The Fonda is now in front of the
That's right. They used to have the jewelry store there, right? And you know, when you walk on the south side of the plaza, and you see the little stores, as you enter where Spitz was, look down on the floor because there's glass. There's little tiles of glass on the floor. That's where Spitz jewelry used to be. Thank you. Thanks. Are you from Santa Fe? Oh, well, okay. In 1865, 4 Sisters of Charity from Cincinnati arrived. 2 were nurses who had served in the Civil War. One of the nurses was placed in charge of the orphanage, and the other was to act as administrator in the first tuberculosis sanatorium in New Mexico, St. Vincent's Tuberculosis Sanatorium. Looking at the 1890 Hartman Map, we will note that in 1866, a new street, which became known as Lincoln Avenue, was cut north-south through the middle of Fort Marcy Post, formerly the Presidio, passing through the spot that marked the 1791 entrance to the Presidio. Widening the entrance to accommodate Lincoln Avenue required removing the old jail and guardhouse that were attached to the west side of the Palace of the Governor, thus foreshortening the palace. This information can be found in El Palacio, Fall, 1982, Volume 88, number 3, page 35, just in case you want to look it up. The street was named Lincoln to commemorate the U.S. president who had been assassinated the previous year. Various other improvements to Fort Marcy were designated in the 1890 Hartman Map. 6 adobe houses for officers were built on the southwest end of the post. 3 of them faced Grant Avenue, and 3 others faced Lincoln Avenue. The backyard separating these houses eventually became Sheridan Street. New facilities were also built for the livestock and equipment. The red circle indicates a gate. That's where Connie's grocery store used to be. Were any of you here when Connie's grocery store was up there? You were here? Of course you. Okay. Nobody else? Okay. Here is a perspective view of Fort Marcy. Note the surrounding landmark. Here is another perspective view of Fort Marcy taken from the east, showing the gate that I just pointed out to you. The band and NCO, or non-commissioned officers' quarters, a single building, was built at the corner of Palace Avenue and Lincoln Street. This building was eventually torn down, and the Museum of Fine Arts now stands there. Here is one of the officers' residence that was and is still located on Lincoln Avenue. It's in back of the Fine Arts Building. It became residence for Edgar Lee Hewett, director of the Museum of Fine Art. The commanding officer's residence was built on Washington Avenue. I believe it became the Santa Fe Club, which was known for its wild parties. The house later became the residence of Governor Miguel Otero. It is now the site of the First Interstate Bank. Another improvement, the bandstand on the plaza was moved to the north end to make room for the obelisk, which commemorates New Mexico's defenders against both savages, Indian attacks and Confederates. This is the 13th United States Infantry Band standing in front of the obelisk. In 1969, a man dressed in overalls took a hammer and chiseled out the word savage. In 1866, Palace Avenue, which ran in front of the palace, was extended east through the Cienega. Today at the site you will find a short street which runs south into Palace Avenue, and it is Cienega Street. Here is the Cienega in 1873. Starting in 1869, Bishop Lamy embarked on an ambitious church building program and had the cathedral built in a rather unique fashion. The old adobe church was not torn down, but the towers and facades of the new one began to rise far out of the old church. Lamy recruited the architects Antoine and Projectus Moulet, father and son from France, and stonemasons from France and Italy. It is designed in the Romanesque style of Lamy's native Auvergne. The golden brown sandstone for the building's exterior was quarried from the top of a prominent mesa near the town of Lamy. This town was given its name by the Santa Fe Railroad in honor of the Archbishop. The light volcanic tufa for the ceiling vaults came from Cerro Morgino, 12 miles north of Santa Fe. It was not recorded from where the white and reddish stone for the facade arches and part of its wall came from. The old church was then removed, adobe by adobe, through the main entrance and was used to form the high terrace in front of the new cathedral and to fill Water Street. The cathedral was completed in 1884. Here is the cathedral being built. All that has survived of the old church is the adobe chapel on the northeast side of the cathedral, which houses La Conquistadora, Lady of Conquest. It's still there, and you need to go in it. It's lovely. In 1874, Bishop Lamy had Loretto Chapel built. It was constructed of the quarried stone, possibly from the same area as the stone used for the cathedral. A few years later, Loretto Academy for Girls was erected north of the chapel, and a convent for the nuns was erected south of the chapel. The academy and convent were both torn down in 1971. The school building was not replaced and is now used as a staging area for artists selling their works. The convent was replaced by the Inn of Loretto. By 1875, land donated by the Roman Catholic Archdiocese to the federal government was established as the National Cemetery and used after the Civil War for the reinterment of 265 Union soldiers who had died during the brief military activities at Fort Marcy and the Battle of Glorieta Pass. It was also used to reinter Confederate soldiers. In 1878, Lew Wallace was appointed President Rutherford B. Hayes as territorial governor of New Mexico to clean up corrupting influences in the government known as the Santa Fe Ring. The men belonging to the Santa Fe Ring were wealthy and powerful landowners who controlled much of the territory's political and economic activities. Some of its members were unscrupulous Anglo lawyers who took land from Spanish-speaking New Mexicans who were ignorant of law and taxes. During Lew Wallace's administration, 1878 to 1881, he wrote his famous book, Ben-Hur, in his study at the palace. St. Michael's College was built in 1878 by the Christian Brothers and offered courses beyond the high school level. In 1947, this school, not the building, was moved south of town and became a private college known as the College of Santa Fe. The college used the Army barracks of Bruns General Hospital, built in 1942, named after Colonel Earl Harvey Bruns. He was regarded as one of the foremost authorities on pulmonary tuberculosis. I just found out this information, and growing up, Bruns Hospital was down on Sirius Road, out in the country. It was out in the country then. And we would ask, what is going on there? And I remember my mother saying something about they were bringing soldiers here from Japan, from China, that had oriental diseases. Well, I just found out it was used as a TB sanatorium. So that is something new. I'm finding out every day. By 1880, the AT&SF Railroad entered New Mexico, thus hastening the arrival of many. Because of the difficult terrain, a high plateau, the train bypassed Santa Fe in favor of a more direct route between Las Vegas and Albuquerque. Disappointed and not wanting to miss out on the opportunity, the citizens of Santa Fe raised $150,000 in county bonds for an 18.1-mile spur, supposedly made of outmoded and below standard grade rail, to connect Santa Fe to the railroad line. The arrival of the railroad brought the end of commerce over the old Santa Fe Trail. Also in 1880, the New Mexico Bureau of Immigration was established. It wasted no time in advertising the Claire Hotel at the corner of Lincoln Avenue and San Francisco Street, where the Orr House used to be. Also in 1880, the Labor Bureau of Immigration was established. It wasted no time in advertising the territory's healing climate as one of the ways to promote New Mexico during its long struggle for statehood. With the advent of the railroad, Santa Fe was flooded with a variety of architectural styles and materials. Santa Fe was beginning to resemble any town USA. Large, imposing Victorian buildings were built on or near the plaza. Again, this was specifically done in an attempt to win congressional approval for statehood. Good examples of these large, imposing buildings are, next one, the old high school, the next one, the county courthouse on Palace Avenue, built on an ice skating ring formed by a cienega. It was destroyed by fire in 1909 and replaced by the Coronado Building. The Katherine Building, the Armory, which moved south of town, and then even further south of town now, the Elks Club, part of the new History Museum, and the first two-dome territorial capitol, which was built in 1886 and burned down in 1892. The Clare Hotel at the corner of Lincoln Avenue and San Francisco Street. The Palace Hotel on Washington. Have we done that one yet? Okay. St. Vincent Sanatorium, built in 1878 and burned down in 1896. The Spiegelberg building is still there, but the ornate design was removed to conform to the Santa Fe style. Most of these buildings no longer exist. By 1881, Santa Fe was encouraging people to come to their town. Rio Chiquito, the filthiest street, was cleaned up and renamed Water Street. The first water and light company system was installed. A reservoir was built in the Santa Fe Canyon, damming the Santa Fe River, thus preventing major flooding. Really, it did flood. It really did. You don't believe me, I can tell you. I can see the look on your face. You don't believe me. But we really did have water there sometime. The county commission contracted the Santa Fe Gas Company for 25 lampposts and lanterns for street lighting. By 1883, 15 fire plugs were installed at $100 a plug. A hydroelectric plant was built in Upper Canyon Road. Street name signs were erected. Here is a panoramic map of Santa Fe in 1882. Take a closer look. Notice how everything is expanding around the plaza. Here is a later photograph of the same area, 1900 to 1909. In 1882, Adolphe Francis Bandelier, a Swiss-born pioneer, archaeologist, and ethnohistorian, made his home in Santa Fe on Paseo de Peralta. Bishop Lamy retired in 1885. He died in 1888 and was buried in St. Francis Cathedral. The Women's Board of Trade was founded in 1892. The object of the organization was to advance every interest pertaining to the welfare and prosperity of the oldest city of the United States. The standing committees were finance, library, visiting and relief, intelligence, improvement, industrial house, women's exchange, prevention of cruelty to animals, reception, education, press, and the cemetery. I think they had something like about 50 women in this women's board. So the first year it expended $160 in cash. The cash balance at hand was in 1899 was $220.70. This building was built in 1905. It eventually became the Santa Fe Public Library. It served as a library until 1987, when the library moved across the street into the old City Hall. The building itself is now the New Mexico State Photo Archives. In 1900, a second territorial capitol building was completed just south of the river and had only one dome. After World War II, the dome was removed and a stately territorial design was instituted. The building was renamed the Bataan Building in memory of the victims and survivors of the 1941 Bataan Death March, among whom was a disproportionate number of New Mexicans. The federal building, which was meant to be Santa Fe's first capitol building, was started in 1853 and was completed in 1889. By 1895, Fort Marcy officially ceased to function as a military post. The property was conveyed to the city of Santa Fe, which transferred it to the Board of Education. In the earlier years of 20th century, great strides were made to educate the youth, and schools were built. This was the first ward school on Canyon Road, originally a dance hall. It was purchased in 1876 to be used as the first public school. By 1901, the city of Santa Fe was incorporated in hopes that a municipal government could boost Santa Fe's declining prosperity due to being bypassed by the railroad and the closing of the Army post. It became apparent that Santa Fe's best chance for prosperity was to become a town for tourists who would be attracted by the climate and the picturesque adobe architecture. Santa Fe style became a visible sign of the city's ancient heritage. Many buildings were changed to conform to the standards set by the proponents of this style. The style is very different when contrasted to the architecture of 100,000 towns in the United States. Santa Fe would no longer be anywhere USA. The requirements were flat roofs, long, low house rather than a high, narrow one, adobe, lime, or cement finish, color tones in cream, brown, reddish brown range, no columns, and no picket fences. Here is a good example, Amelia White's house, which is now the School of Advanced Research. Santa Fe also became a haven for tuberculosis patients. It was estimated that 1/3 of Santa Fe's artists and intellectuals originally came to the city because they suffered from tuberculosis or other respiratory ailments. William Carr Lane, who became governor in 1852, stated, "Your country is one of the very healthiest on the globe." John Gamim was one of those who suffered from TB. He was the architect of many well-known buildings in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. At this time, many creative individuals, including artists, scholars, and architects, came and contributed greatly to the city's cultural development. To name just a few, Mary Cabot Wheelwright, Mary Austin, Frank Applegate, Sylvanus Morley, Margarita Stewart Dietrich, Jesse L. Nussbaum, Ernest Thompson Seton, Mary Coulter, Kenneth Milton Chapman, and Frank Springer. In 1908, the palace had fallen into such a state of ruin that local business people were considering tearing it down. In 1909, the Palace of the Governor became the Museum of the Territory of New Mexico, with Edgar Lee Hewett, remember that name now, Edgar Lee Hewett, as its founder and first director. Hewett was a leading southwestern archaeologist of his day and also had been the driving force behind the enactment of the Antiquities Act of 1906, which protected ancient Indian ruins in the United States. He also helped found the School of American Archaeology, also located in the museum. From 1909 to 1913, Jesse L. Nussbaum and Sylvanus Morley presided over the restoration of the palace. They became leading proponents of a truly radical idea, restoring ruins to the point where untrained visitors could visualize the way things had been when people had lived there. Artists came to New Mexico seeking fresh material. They were bored with the subject matter of Holland, Brittany, France, and Normandy, and were in need of a stimulating subject. However, many also came because they had tuberculosis. In 1912, New Mexico became a state, with the Tejanos in the monster state to the east as our neighbors. Are there any Texans here? Uh-oh. Okay, here is a photo of President Taft signing New Mexico into statehood. The building constructed by New Mexico for the Panama, California Exposition in San Diego, as shown here, was built in celebration of the inauguration of Panama Canal. It was sponsored by the AT&SF Railroad and was a composite of 6 Spanish missions: Acoma, Laguna, San Felipe, Cochiti, Santa Ana, and Pecos Pueblos. This building became the model for the New Mexico Museum of Fine Art, designed by Rapp and Rapp. The site chosen for the new museum was the old NCO and band quarters of Fort Marcy at the corner of Palace Avenue and Lincoln Street. I found this following article in El Palacio magazine. It was entitled, "On April 17, 1916, excavation supervised by Jesse L. Nussbaum. A force of 36 men and 20 teams of horses and mules begin demolishing the Presidio's old headquarters building. Not much of interest was found during the first part of the excavation, but later 1/2 dozen human burials were found, including one 8 feet below the surface. One burial contained the gem of all finds, a necklace of turquoise beads and abalone shells taken from a skeleton found on an adobe floor, and with the necklace was a shattered arrow which found embedded in the spine of the Indian. Today, one specimen drawer can easily hold all that remains from the wagon loads of potsherds that were taken from LA 930. However, this excavation provides a starting point for archaeological excavations in downtown Santa Fe today. An impetus for artists to migrate to Santa Fe was a new museum with its unique open-door exhibition policy. This policy stated that any person actively creating artwork in New Mexico would be allowed to participate in the museum's annual exhibits. No judge would impose his own biases on the selection of artwork and come between the artist and the viewing public. It was artist Robert Henry, a leading figure of the Ashcan School of American Realism, who convinced Huey to adopt this policy. In 1917, President Wilson proclaimed the ruins of the Indian cliff dwellers in Frijoles Canyon the Bandelier National Monument. In 1919, World War I, tanks were used to destroy the Kinsel Livestock Company meat market. This was in preparation for building the present La Fonda. If you wanted to drive the tank as part of a demolition operation, you first had to buy a U.S. savings bond. La Fonda was constructed at a cost of $200,000. The Spanish Pueblo Revival design is the work of the firm Rapp and Henderson. In 1925, the Santa Fe Railroad ticket office, located in the building designed by John Gamim, across the street from La Fonda, arranged sightseeing tours to the nearby Indian pueblos in a 15-passenger Packard touring coach. These tours were known as the Indian Detours. The Indian Detour Packard touring coaches were kept in the garage south of La Fonda. That's what I was telling you about, okay? John Gamim in 1926 was hired to transform La Fonda into a first-rate Harvey house. He added the 6-story bell tower and new wings along Water Street and the old Santa Fe Trail. The 5th floor and the bell tower, when I got married, which was in the room down, the Santa Fe room right here, when I got married there, it was on a Sunday here, and they didn't allow liquor served. So my parents rented a room up on the 5th floor where they served liquor, and people would go out on the bell tower and look around and drink their drink. So I do have a few stories like that. St. Francis Parochial School was located east of La Fonda, across from the cathedral on the corner of San Francisco Street and Cathedral Place. The school was torn down, and the vacant lot then served as a dirt parking lot for the hotel. After a time, La Fonda built their parking building on it. Now remember, I told you, remember Edgar Lee Hewett. You remember who he was, okay? In 1926, Zozobra, the eerie but delightful fixture at Fiesta, was conceived by marionette carver Gustav Baumann and designed by artist Will Schuster, archaeologist Sylvania Morris, and the editor of the Santa Fe New Mexican, Dana Johnson. It is believed that Old Man Gloom was inspired by Edgar Lee Hewett, who was widely disliked by the Santa Fe artist community. Charles Lindbergh landed his plane in Santa Fe on September 25, 1927. The airport was located at the junction of Cerrillos Road and Airport Road. In 1928, the Spanish Colonial Arts Society was established and eventually became the Spanish Market. In 1931, the Laboratory of Anthropology opened. Also, in 1931, the Leipzig Theater opened. It received its name from the first letter of each of Nathan Salmon's 6 grandchildren. In 2000, the theater underwent a year-long $8.2 million renovation and now houses an 821-seat venue for the performing arts, films, lectures, and literary events. As a child, my mother would take us to the movies at the Leipzig Theater, and we would always sit in the rocking chairs in the back of the theater. These were leather rocking chairs, 2 rows of leather rocking chairs in the back of Leipzig Theater. And they also had smoking up in the balcony. So, by the 1930s, Santa Fe's place in the Southwest in America was firmly established with the creation of many new institutions. It was also promoted extensively by the railroad as a tourist destination. In the 1940s, the Manhattan Project took over the Los Alamos Ranch School grounds, and Santa Fe became a place of espionage. My cousin, who sits right there, her father worked in Los Alamos. At 109 East Palace Avenue, a plaque placed on the doorway reads, "All the men and women who made the first atomic bomb passed through this portal to their secret mission, Los Alamos. Their creation in 27 months of the weapons that ended World War II was one of the greatest scientific achievements of all time." Zook's Pharmacy was 2 doors down from my father's restaurant where the Haagen-Dazs ice cream parlor now is located. This pharmacy was owned by John Zook, a graduate of Philadelphia College of Pharmacy. He was married to Zelma Brown, and their only child was Catherine, who became a well-known figure in Santa Fe society. Joseph Grigolovich, an Argentine of Lithuanian ancestry, whose father had founded a successful chain of drugstores, was one of the most legendary field operatives in KGB history. Zook's Pharmacy served as a base and safe haven for KGB operatives, planning the assassination of Leon Trotsky in Mexico. The second assassination attempt on Trotsky was successful. Grigolovich laid low in Santa Fe until 1941 and then parted company with 33-year-old Katie Zook. There were dubious allegations that the KGB continued to use Zook's Pharmacy as part of its atomic espionage program against Los Alamos. In 1944, Klaus Fuchs, another Soviet spy working inside Los Alamos, drove down to Santa Fe and met with Harry Gold, another spy, and passed everything that the KGB needed for the Soviets to build their own Fat Man atomic bomb. On the next day, Gold met with David Greenglass, a low-level machinist working inside Los Alamos, who was also another KGB spy. David's sister's name was Ethel, and Ethel's husband's name was Julius Rosenberg. During World War II, many of the bartenders, cocktail waitresses, and desk clerks and staff at other various hotels were undercover agents for the United States. In 1943, a Japanese internment camp was situated in the converted Civilian Conservation Corps camp on the outskirts of Santa Fe. It held 2,100 Japanese and Japanese Americans. 2 Japanese died at this camp and are buried in Rosario Cemetery. They died of old age. In 1951, John Gamim designed a modified Pueblo Revival style Santa Fe High School. If this building looks familiar, it is now the Santa Fe City Hall building. It was a school I went to and graduated from there. This building in the Territorial Revival style was designed also by John Gamim and was called the Bardinelli Building. It served as a city hall for a time and then as a fire station, police headquarters, and jail. In this building also, if this building also looks familiar to you, it is now the city library. The city library used to be across the street at what is now the State History and Photo Archives. In 1953, the Museum of International Folk Art opened. In 1957, world-class seasonal opera was founded. In 1960, demolition of Jesse Nussbaum's house on Washington Street sparked the formation of the historic Santa Fe Foundation. A hotel now stands on this site. The street to the north of Nussbaum is called Nussbaum Street. In 1962, the plaza was declared a National Historic Landmark. And commercial buildings on the plaza's 3 sides, which were all erected within the past 20th century, were unified by portal, giving the plaza a look of old Santa Fe. If you remember, this is the 4th law of the Indies. That is, sidewalks are to be sheltered by portals. In 1964, the renaissance of the Santa Fe Bohemian art colony began with the passing of many of the old-timers and the coming of the new. However, in the 1980s, that too was over. Committed artists were now returning to urban centers. In 1966, the Roundhouse was built. At that corner, where the Roundhouse is, was the house that I grew up the first 3 years of my life. The house was right there. In 1968, the Barrio de Analco was nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. It contains more buildings built before 1900 than any other part of Santa Fe. In 1972, La Conquistadora was kidnapped from the cathedral by a pair of insensitive youths who tried to sell her through a black market of religious arts. In 1973, La Conquistadora was returned to the cathedral, and placed in her special chapel on the north side of the cathedral, which had been built in 1770 specifically for this statue. In 1976, the Santuario de Guadalupe Church took on a new life and is now a center for maintaining and furthering the Hispanic tradition of New Mexico, displaying works of Hispanic artists and craftsmen. In 1980, the city and county of Santa Fe enacted the ordinance requiring that archaeological and historical study precede commercial and residential developments. In 1980, Maria Martinez de San Ildefonso Potter died. The same year witnessed the horrific riot at the New Mexico State Penitentiary. In 1982, a 2-year renovation of the Museum of Fine Art was completed at a cost of $1.43 million, with funding supplemented by a $135,000 donation. In 1987, the Museum of Indian Art and Culture opened. It houses the largest collection of Southwest Native American material culture. It is located in the 1922 United States Post Office building designed by John Gaumeen. I used to go there with my mother when she'd go to buy stamps. In 1990, Greer Garson donated money to the College of Santa Fe, helping transform its physical education complex into a state-of-the-art communication center, the Garson Studios. 1997, Georgia O'Keeffe Museum was founded. In 2005, St. Francis de Assisi Cathedral was elevated to a basilica by Pope Benedict XVI, and Santa Fe received the distinction of being the first American community to be designated a creative city by the United Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. In 2008, the community center opened. The 72,000 square foot facility sits near the site of the old Santa Fe High School Sweeney Gymnasium, which had been converted into a convention center when the school opened. It was this gymnasium that I played volleyball and where my graduation ceremony occurred. It was turned down. In 2009, the New Mexico History Museum opened its 96,000 square foot facility with a 210-seat auditorium, 2 smaller theaters, an educational theater, and the Spiegelberg shop. Remember the Spiegelberg? There was that ornate-looking building on the plaza that I told you they took down it's named after this family. In 2011, the Modern Library ranked Death Comes for the Archbishop number 61 of the 100 best English language novels of the 20th century. And if you have any other information, I would be glad to hear from you. Thank you.